All right, welcome everybody to our Sound for Video help session. Today's the 31st of March 2016, and today we're going to talk a little bit about dynamic microphones. And before we do that, I wanted to just kind of circle back to our Google Plus page and where we put the Google Hangout. Rick, who's actually here with us today. Thanks for joining us today, Rick.
Course.
And we will. Rick actually had a really interesting point that he brought up on the Google Plus page. I wanted to go ahead and just kind of read that, Rick, if that's okay. And I think it's a great point. We'll cover that in a little more detail here.
Sure.
Rick wrote, I use both the Shure SM58 and Rode Procaster dynamic mics. I couldn't get enough level from either mic until I purchased a Cloudlifter CL-1 amplifier. The preamps on my audio interface didn't have enough gain for the dynamic mics. The Cloudlifter gave me an extra 25 dB without adding any noticeable noise. I recommend the Cloudlifter to anyone who needs more gain from a dynamic mic. And I joked with Rick, I think really you kind of, in some respects, stole the thunder. Not really, but I think great minds think alike. And that's actually a very practical issue that comes up, excuse me, as soon as you start using a dynamic microphone, because they're very different to what we're used to working with when we're shooting film. Almost all of the other mics, shotgun mics, small diaphragm condensers, are all powered condenser microphones. And they tend to be very, very sensitive, whereas dynamic mics are not particularly sensitive from that standpoint, and they need a lot more gain to get a line level signal out of them. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So Rick, I'm really glad that you brought that up. Art also had a question. Art Johnson asked, I use a Blue Yeti for voice recording and I find it too sensitive. Even with pop filter, you can pick up breathing. I try to keep the gain down, but then I feel like I'm compromising the sound quality. So I thought even using something like the ATR 2100 would do the job. Your thoughts? So Art, that is a perfect question to kind of kick us off today on our discussion here. Now, if you go to a lot of podcasting sites, if you go to voiceover sites, if you go to pretty much a lot of places on the internet that talk about recording dialogue for voiceover or for podcasts or for things of that nature, almost always it seems like well, not always, but a lot of the time the recommendation is a large diaphragm condenser microphone. The Blue Yeti, I think it's either a large diaphragm or it may be a medium diaphragm type, but it is a condenser microphone, so it is very sensitive. And so, Art, you bring up a really great point, because one of the challenges is as those of us that are recording film and video, a lot of times we're working outside of studios, professional acoustically treated studios. And so a lot of times when we're recording our voiceover or narration parts for our film and video projects, we're working in acoustical environments that are not optimal for recording. So the trick is that if you go and put a very, very sensitive condenser microphone in that type of scenario, you have a tendency not only to pick up a great recording of the voice, but also a lot of room ambiance. And oftentimes that's going to reveal any sort of reverberation issues that you have in your room. And it's not going to sound as awesome as you were hoping in many cases. So that's actually why I would often suggest that people consider dynamic microphones. Now, dynamic microphones are a little bit different in terms of how they work. They do not require any sort of power, so they don't require phantom power or plug-in power. And they literally work with just the sound that your voice makes. Moving the air particles is what actually moves the diaphragm in a dynamic microphone, and that creates an electrical signal that is then sent to your preamplifier and amplified. And what that means, though, in practical terms, is that your preamplifier has to do a fair bit of amplification to get the signal to a level that's actually usable for your recording. And so that's kind of a double-edged sword. It's good and it's bad. It's bad because, your preamplifier that you're currently using may or may not have enough gain to actually do that effectively. But it's good because you're not going to pick up nearly as much room noise or a lot of the ambiance that you don't necessarily want in your recording. So while a dynamic microphone will respond quite differently than a condenser microphone will, and typically my sense is that dynamic microphones, the way I kind of think of them or describe them, is that they don't sound quite as detailed. And in a lot of ways, they tend to have a very warm low end, especially if you work in really, really close to the microphone like this. They tend to really kind of pick up a lot of that low end presence. Um, they can have a tendency if you do work up on them closely like that, they can have a tendency to get a little bit woolly, where there's too much of that low end that it's picking up. So they're a little bit different in terms of how they work, although condenser microphones have a proximity effect as well. But nevertheless, typically you do have to work a little bit closer to a dynamic mic. But I think the vocal sound that they can make is a record is really quite nice, and I think it can work in a lot of cases. So if you are working in a case or in a scenario or a location where you don't have any sort of proper acoustic treatment, and even I mean even in my room here, I do have this acoustic treatment. You can see it. Right. Actually, that's the second one. But you can see the panels that I have on the walls here and such. That helps quite a bit. But I still actually really like the sound of this particular mic that I'm using here. And I'm going to move my camera around a little bit in this session. It's not stabilized, so I'm going to apologize in advance. I'll warn you when I'm going to move it. It'll get a little bit shaky. But let me just kind of move this down a little bit here and show you this first mic. This is my Electrovoice RE20, and that is a dynamic microphone. This microphone, kind of just in terms of its history, it's been around for a long, long time. I don't know exactly when they first started producing it, but it's been used in the radio broadcast world for a long, long time. And in fact, I think that's why a lot of people like the sound. It has that very, very rich low end kind of sound to it. And as you saw on the design here, I'm going to move it here again, the camera. It has these vents along the side, and the idea with these vents is, my understanding is that these are to help prevent popping or plosives. So when you do work up really, really close on the microphone, like I am here and like most radio announcers would, you can have a tendency to get those plosives when you say the letter P or B, especially. The microphone can kind of pop. And these vents are supposed to help that. I also still use a pop filter because I've noticed that even with those, which is a pretty good design, it works pretty nicely. You still can get some plosives. So it's not a total 100% fail safe, but it does work nicer than some other microphones. So this one I really like. This one is a little bit more on the pricey side as far as microphones go. This one runs about $450 is the typical price for this one. There's also an RE, I think it's a 320, which is a kind of its little brother, if you will. That's also a dynamic microphone. It sounds a little bit different. I like the sound of this one a little better personally, but that's kind of a subjective thing at some level. And let me just what I'm gonna do here is gonna talk about several different choices, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit about the gain considerations. Because again, as we mentioned before, you need a fair bit of gain to make these microphones work. So let's go ahead and just talk about some other kind of common options out there. These are just the ones that I happen to have on hand. Here we have one that you've probably all seen before. This is a Shure SM58. This is kind of the classic stage dynamic microphone for vocalists. And you've probably seen these. Almost every live show venue will have some of these on hand. Typically, they'll have several of them on hand. This one runs about $100 US. And I think that it's never bad to have this microphone in your kit. I think it's a worthwhile investment. Also, Shure makes another one called the SM57. Now, a lot of people don't think of this as sorry, everyone knows it's a dynamic microphone that knows about it, but most people, I think, don't think of this as a vocal microphone. The reality is, from my understanding, it's actually the same exact capsule as the SM58. It's the grill that's different, and the grill, in theory, is optimized for instrument use. However, one thing to consider is this is actually a little bit less imposing than the SM58 in some ways. I'm not holding them at the same distance, so it doesn't necessarily look that way. This one's a little easier to hide if you're going to use it as a plant mic, although there are lots of better options for plant mics. But the reason I show you that one is that they are used in vocal applications plenty. And in fact, the President of the United States, when he speaks in his Rose Garden, on the podium there, they actually have two of these Shure SM57s. So they are used for for vocals in plenty of situations. And I think they can be a fine choice there. Another dynamic microphone, which is pretty popular amongst the podcasting crowd, is the Audio Technica AT. This is the 2005. There's also an ATR 2100, which is almost identical. I think it has the same capsule. It has a slightly different body, slightly different grill, and I think the switch is a little different as well. But this is a very interesting one, and I think a really nice starter microphone. And in fact, I think it could be used effectively even beyond starting out. And the reason I say that is the reason I say it's a starter is that you can see here there's both a USB output and there's also an XLR output. And again, there's also a volume control and a little 3.5 millimeter jack here for monitoring, so you can plug your headphones in there. And the reason I really like this one is that when I have to be mobile and I need to travel really lightly, this is nice because um, you can plug it in directly to your computer to record. You don't have to have an audio interface. You don't have to have any other sort of preamplifier. It has its own preamplifier and analog to digital converter built into it. I will say, and the reason I say it's a good starter mic is that the analog to digital converter and the preamp in this are not amazing. They're pretty, they're okay. These mics usually sell for around, I've seen them as low as $45, and they range up closer to 60 or 70, I think. But again, a great choice. The built-in preamplifier and analog to digital converter that works when you plug it in via USB directly to your computer is okay. It tends to have a little bit of high-end noise in it that I didn't really care for, but it does definitely work in a pinch. And then the nice thing is that, again, because it has an XLR output as well, you can eventually upgrade and buy or either feed this into a field recorder, or into an audio interface on your computer and get even better sound. And I think that when you do that, it actually has a very nice sound. There was a site online, and if you Google it, I'm sure you'll find it, but there was a site online where they actually did a comparison of a Neumann U87, which is like almost a $3,000 US mic, and a couple of other condenser mics compared to this. And they did kind of a blind test, and a lot of people had a hard time picking out the more expensive microphones. So again, if you go straight into a quality preamplifier via the XLR output, I think you can get some really nice sound. So this is one that I really like to recommend as a starter, because you can start right away, plug it right into your computer, start recording for around $50 US, and get some pretty high quality sound. And you can improve its quality even more down the road when you do invest in a decent recorder or my audio interface. Okay, let me show you. I think I have just maybe one more. Let's take a look really quick here. We're going to come back to that. Okay, next up here, you're seeing the Shure SM7B. This microphone is also a dynamic microphone, although it is often used, again, in radio broadcasts, though it is also often used in recording situations. And in fact, it's my understanding that the original Shure SM7, of which this is sort of a redesign or a kind of an update, the original Shure SM7 was used to record a lot of really epic music albums that are out there. And one of them is Michael Jackson's Thriller. So whether you like that or hate it, there's no question that that was a very, very popular album. And the Shure SM7 was the one that they used. This is just, again, an update to that. And again, this is a dynamic microphone. I have used this one. I really, really like this one as well. It does have that really rich low end as well, especially when you get up close on it. And they've done a lot to sort of manage the potential for plosives, or again, the pops that you get if you are working up close on it. So, and again, anyway, that's another option that is available out there. This one runs about $350 US. So again, a very nice option as well. I don't. I ended up getting the Shure SM7, or sorry, the Electrovoice RE20, which is the one I showed you here earlier. I really, really like the sound on this. The one thing that I really like about this one as well, as you can see here, this little switch down here. I can show you that on. Actually, I'll just show you on the website here. But that is a high pass filter. And one of the things I think that makes this really helpful, and not all of the microphones have them. I believe this and the Shure SM7B have them, but the others do not. The others that we've talked about do not. And the reason that's really helpful is that again, these microphones tend to have that very, very rich low end, and sometimes, to be entirely honest, it's a little bit more than you really want, at least in some of the projects that I do, and so I like to be able to roll that off, and in fact, what you're hearing right now, I am recording with the RE20, and I do have the high pass filter turned on. And the reason I do that again is because it gets just a little too much for in terms of intelligibility. If intelligibility is a really kind of a high priority, you may want to turn that on. In most cases where I do my voiceovers, I will turn that on. But if I want that really rich sound, I can do that. I can turn it off and get that very, very rich sound as well. In fact, if I'm going to mute for just a second here, and I'm going to switch off the high pass filter just so you can hear what that sounds like. So if you give me just a second here, I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to mute, and I will be right back with you. Okay, and now here is with the high pass filter turned off. I don't know if you can hear the difference there. It depends probably on what you're listening on, but there is a little bit of a difference. Let me go ahead and switch back. I'm going to, again, turn the high pass filter back on just so you can hear what that sounds like. Okay, and the high pass filter is back on. So you can see there is a little bit of difference in terms of the, again, the low end response of the microphone when you turn that high pass filter on. So I find that really helpful, and that's one of the reasons I ended up going with the RE20 over the Shure SM7B, which is also a very, very nice microphone. Actually, no, it's not the reason I went. They both have the high pass filter. The reason was I just actually preferred the sound of the RE20. Again, when you start getting up into that level, I think it really becomes a subjective matter. It's totally fine. Whichever one you prefer is a valid reason to get it. So that's totally fine. All right, let's talk a little bit about the gain. Again, we talked about the fact that dynamic microphones need a fair bit of gain. So while they're less sensitive and they pick up less room ambiance, they do need a fair bit of gain to work. Now, Rick and I were actually talking before. Rick, would you mind just sort of sharing a little bit about your audio interface and what you like about it, but some of its limitations in terms of gain? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
yeah, that's fine. I've had a setup with I do music as well as voiceovers, so I have both the SM58 that I'll use for vocals and a Rode Procaster, which looks just like your Electrovoice, similar, but that's on a boom stand right over my computer, so I can use that for voiceover. And the audio interface I'm using, they're both XLR inputs. It's a Roland Octacapture, and it has good preamps in it, but both of those dynamic mics, I really had to be right on top of them and shouting a bit to get enough level. And I was disappointed and thought maybe I should get another audio interface, but I saw the product called the Cloudlifter, and that gives a lot of gain to it. And once I put that in, it's just like a little XLR setup. And of course, you put that on the screen, you can see what it is, just a little box, XLR in, XLR out. It does need 48 volts. My interface did have the 48 volts, which it can be fine for a condenser mic, but that powers the amplifier and the Cloudlifter. And it's really made a world of difference because now I don't have to shout into the dynamic mic. I can move it a couple inches away, get the level right, and not feel that I'm right at the bottom of it, or when I look at the waveform in Audition that I can barely see anything, which is what it was like before, is I can see the waveform at about -12, -15 where I want it. And I really like it. It's made my two dynamic microphones usable.
Yeah, that is great, and I agree. I have had lots of friends. I don't personally own a Cloudlifter. Incidentally, there's another one as well called the Fethead. Um, just so you're aware, that's another similar product. But I have friends who are in the same situation. In fact, some of them have ribbon microphones, and ribbon microphones are kind of a special case as well. They need a lot of gain as well, unless they're active ribbon microphones. So yeah, so these are fantastic if you are working with a recorder or an audio interface that doesn't have a whole lot of gain. And remind me, Rick, I think you said the Octapre which you're using, your audio interface tops out at 50 dB of gain.
Yeah, it's adjustable and it goes from 0 to 50, but I had the dynamic mics up at 50 and was really close to them and still could barely see anything when I was looking at audition. But if you go to the Cloudlifter site, they have a lot of before and after examples, videos of
Okay.
showing the two. And that I saw it and I said, I got to get it. And it's definitely worth the money.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I think this is a great solution here in cases where, again, you are going to be using a dynamic microphone, and particularly for those who are Zoom H4n um, owners, and I happen to be one, by the way. I'm not singling anybody out. I am a Zoom H4n owner myself. Let me just you can see there's my H4n. The problem with the H4n, and again, a lot of other um, what's the right term? More affordable audio interfaces and recorders, especially in the previous generations, didn't provide a whole lot of gain. Or if you pushed to the top of the gain range on their preamplifiers, you tended to get quite a bit of noise. So if you do have a recorder like that and you are going to be working with dynamic microphones, again, I think the Cloudlifter and the Fethead are pretty good options to do the additional gaining for you without stressing these preamplifiers as much and ending up with a nice clean signal. So that is one warning again, if you are going to look at getting a dynamic microphone for voiceover or narration, that's something to keep in mind. The moving up this, this is interesting because the Tascam DR60D Mark II, which we've talked a whole ton about, which is certainly one of my favorites in terms of affordable field recorders. Unfortunately, it doesn't act as an audio interface like the Zoom H4n does, but just as in terms of using it as a field recorder, I've actually recorded the Shure SM58 dynamic microphone with this to very good effect. So this tends to have preamplifiers where you probably wouldn't need a Cloudlifter or a Fethead to make it work, just so that you're aware of that. And generally, one of the reasons why I generally recommend it at this point in time, I think I love the Zoom. I'm so happy with the things that Zoom has done, so I'm not trying to be critical of that. But I do think that the Tascam DR60D Mark II is a kind of a step ahead in terms of the preamplifiers themselves. Of course, once you start getting into other recorders, we've talked about our Zoom F8, plenty of gain. You can power pretty much any dynamic microphone with these, so that's not a problem. And of course, working on the review right now of the Sound Devices 633. This one has 72 dB of gain that it provides. So we get plenty there, enough to to power dynamic microphone. I've got a lot going on this desk here. Sorry for the fumbling. The Zoom F8, for the record, has 75 dB of gain. So again, both of those perfectly ample in terms of driving most dynamic microphones. Let me show you another thing, just so you're aware, again, not necessarily something I'm suggesting that you do, but just so you understand another thing that both in radio and in film sound that they've been doing for a lot of years is something that they call gain staging. And we've actually talked about gain staging in a different context before, just setting up your gain structure in terms of, where you set your gain trim and how you use your faders from there. I'm going to move the camera here, but I want to show you how I am actually miking today's episode. This is how I often do it nowadays. Taking you down onto my desk. We have down here a Focusrite Trackmaster Pro. This is actually an analog channel strip. You can see the whole thing. They actually don't even make this anymore. I bought this some years ago. This is my first proper preamplifier. And if we just walk through the whole thing here, so it's got a preamplifier. You can provide phantom power and choose the impedance level here. You can also plug in a guitar if you were doing something like that. But here's the preamplifier trim, gain trim. You have a high pass filter. Here, I'm trying to remember. Oh, yeah, that's the EQ. There's a very, very simple kind of EQ. It's actually a notch EQ, which is sometimes something that can be useful for voice. Kind of in the music recording world, sometimes they'll use that to kind of sweeten the voice a little bit or to remove some sort of problematic frequency between kind of an interaction between the person's voice and the microphone and the preamplifier. It does have a compressor as well. So we do have the compressor engaged. I want to make sure that I don't do any sort of clipping while we're doing this here. and then some other things here. I'm not going to go into all the details, but this is actually providing the first gain stage for us. And then that actually gets fed over here into my Focusrite Sapphire Pro 24. And this is the audio interface that actually takes the signal from the channel strip that I just showed you. It actually does an additional stage of amplification, and then it converts the signal from analog to digital, and that's what you're actually hearing right now. So this is another strategy where you actually have two different amplification stages, and I can show you again here. This is where the microphone is plugged in right here, comes through the channel strip, gets amplified, and then sent over here into the preamplifier over here, and then it's amplified a further bit, and that's what you're hearing today. So that's a strategy called gain staging, where you may have multiple amplification stages for your microphone. And we're doing that here today because again, the Electrovoice RE20 has a very it's gain hungry, if you will. It requires a lot of gain to get a good solid signal out of it. So that's something that you can consider as well. Let's just, and I can actually get easily the same 25 dB of additional gain doing that strategy. In this case, that worked for me, simply because I already had this channel strip. It was just sitting around collecting dust. So now I can put it to good use and use it very much like this Cloudlifter that we talked about before. All right. Let's just quickly, I want to go through a couple of other things here very quickly. Okay, just back to the website again. I'll put links for all these down below, but again, if you are interested in, if you did have a preamplifier that needed a little bit of help to power your dynamic microphones, again, the Cloudlifter is an awesome choice there. The Fethead is a very interesting thing. By the way, FET is actually an audio term. I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but Rick, do you remember?
Stands for field effect transistor. I think that's what FET stands for.
There you
But
go.
go back to my old engineering days. But I did some. I think field effect transistor, but I know the T is transistor and the E is effect. So yeah,
Okay.
it's just really the type of amplifiers. And back in from the tube, the transistor days, that's when the term FET became popular.
Yep. Very good. Thank you. So that's what it refers to here when it says Fethead. So this is a similar type thing. So in this case, if you're driving a dynamic microphone, I believe you do have to feed phantom power from the preamplifier to this device, and then it uses that to do further amplification of your dynamic microphone signal. So that is something to keep in mind if um, you will. So this is a kind of an unusual case. Normally, you don't need phantom power for dynamic microphones, but if you're going to be using one of these, you will need to feed it phantom power, and that's what really gives you that additional gain. Again, the Cloudlifter 25 dB. It looks like the Fethead, do they say here 27 dB? So they're both in kind of the same category there in terms of what they're doing. I don't have personal experience with either one of these. I know Rick, you said you're using the Cloudlifter and very happy with it. I've heard that very same thing from plenty of my other associates and friends that have used it. I don't know anyone personally that's used the Fethead, although I've heard, I've seen plenty about it online. I think that the Fethead runs it's a little bit less expensive. And Rick, what did you end up paying for your Cloudlifter?
I think the Cloudlifter was $149. It was the same price both on Amazon and B&H Photo, and I
Okay.
can get overnight from either one. The Fethead I looked at, I think it was like around $100, but it was like a week and a half or 2 weeks to get it. So
Okay.
I needed to do something, and I wanted to say, I just wanted to get it, and so I saw all the reviews on the Cloudlifter and said it's a little more, but I can get it tomorrow. So that's why I picked it.
Yep. Yeah, and this one, I think I heard about these, the Cloudlifter, before I heard about these. So I think these were kind of in the market first, if I'm not mistaken, or at least from what I've heard. So I think these have been around a little bit longer. They actually have several different products. If you look, there's a whole Cloudlifter series. You can do. There's a couple. There's one that has essentially two channels. There's another one that has some additional things in there. It looks like there's a whole rack, a rack mount of Cloudlifters. So, in any case, lots of options out there. I don't want to bore everyone with that info, but those are two options. Again, we think this one's about $100 US. This one's about 150 for the single channel. So those are things to consider there. I think that's about everything that I had hoped to cover today. So again, if there was something in today's session that we didn't quite cover that you're wondering about, feel free to go ahead and leave a question on the Google Plus page. We'd love to hear that from you. Or if you've got my email, you're certainly, if you're taking the class, you're certainly welcome to email me directly, and I'm happy to continue the discussion there. And we'll talk to you all again next week. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, thanks, Curtis.
Thanks, Rick. Take care.